Hello everybody, in this video I'm going to be showing you how to install butt hinges very neatly and very precisely. So let's get going. Alright, before we get started, just be aware that this video is in the context of furniture making. It is not in the context of construction, joinery, general DIY where you're just wanting to whack out hinge mortises and get the job done. This is for fine furniture makers and cabinet makers. Disclaimer number 2 is, if you're one of the people who has stayed on after that first disclaimer, please make sure you watch my previous video on how to tune these hinges so that the edges are lovely and straight and square and we've got a lovely polished finish on this. This is a cheap hinge from a general DIY supplier and we've made it go from 50p to 50 quid's worth. Well, maybe not that much, but you know. So in this video, just be aware that we're going to be making just a little thing like this to practice hinging into 2 components and check that it works. This bit in particular is going to be used as an example of the 4 ways you can install the hinge incorrectly. I've got different examples cut out on here to show what can go wrong with this and the consequences of that, and I'm going to be showing you those throughout the video. So we're going to be needing marking gauges, we're going to be needing chisels for this, a nice wide one ideally. We need a mallet, and is that it? Yes, I think so. Optional extra, router plane. Alright, so the first thing we're going to need to do, I've forgotten squares, pencils, knives. We're back on track. So before chopping these out, let me just go through the 2 main ways that you are going to be fitting hinges. The first one is into a door, and the second one is going to be fitting them into a box. So this was a batch production project that we did at Wood, the place that I trained at. I studied furniture making as a university degree, so this was technically one of my units for the degree, and we decorated it with the leisure activities we had while at university as well. So it's pretty sentimental to me and it works as a good example in this case. The door is hinged, and around this door you can see that there is an even shadow gap around the whole thing. If you make that door a perfect fit inside this cabinet, then it's going to start binding. Any slight movement of the door is going to make it not very nice to use. So you need to account for a small shadow gap around the outside. And this is pretty easy to achieve when fitting these hinges, which I'll demonstrate later. And the other example of hinging is when you hinge a box lid. So in this case, hinged at the back, these aren't the hinges we're going to be using for this demo, obviously, but it serves as a good example. When you close that box lid, you don't really want a shadow gap around the outside. You want that to be a nice, almost invisible gap. A shadow gap in most cases is not needed. And essentially what you're looking at here is the 2 ways of hinging components together. The door, in this case, is hinged within the outside frame, whereas the box lid is hinged on top of the frame. Inside the frame, on top of the frame. So when it's inside, you want the shadow gap. When it's on top, you don't. So you can have doors that are hinged on top of a frame. Cases of this would be like kitchen cupboards are quite commonly mounted on top of the frame. What else? It's pretty obvious to see. Boxes generally aren't done the other way around, but it's not to say you can't. I definitely have seen it in some cases, but the majority of the time it is hinged on top of the carcass. So keep that in mind as we're chopping out these hinges. It will become relevant later on. All right. So for this demonstration, I'm just going to be installing 1 single hinge in the middle of this to show you how to accurately chop out that recess. This is not going to be a video on how to fit a door or anything like that. I will be covering that in a separate video, but this is definitely a skill on its own. So I'll put the components together. I'll pop the hinge in the center. For this demo, it doesn't really matter where that is too much. And I'm just going to draw where that hinge is on here, just roughly with a pencil. This will give me guidelines with the marking gauge lines later to ensure that I don't just extend these lines across the whole thing needlessly. So we've got them there. I'll just draw them on the inside faces as well. Now for this, it's helpful if you have 2 marking gauges, but it's definitely not a necessity. If you've got a lot of doors to do, then it will be useful to have, but if it's just 1, then yeah, you probably won't. So I will use 1 of them for this demo. The first line we're going to scratch with this marking gauge is when the hinge is on there, we're going to be scratching the line along here. And depending on how deep you make that recess into the wood, that is going to affect the function of the hinge and the overall look of the finished result as well. Let me give you an example of that. If you don't install the hinges in far enough, so we set the marking gauge to be too shallow and you can't get the hinge in to the wood as far as it needs to, then you end up with quite a large gap between the two components when they're hinged. This gap is only going to be prominent when the hinge is opened, which isn't the end of the world, to be honest. In terms of functionality, it still works exactly as it should. The only thing you do get, which affects the looks more than anything, is you get a lot of the knuckle poking out the end here. And you end up seeing those shadow gaps on the outside of the mechanism, which is completely unneeded. It is possible to recess the hinge deeper and hide those. However, if you go too far with this, yes, it looks lovely on the outside, not too much of the hinge showing, none of those horrible shadow gaps, until you try and open it, and it starts binding because you've installed that hinge too deep into the wood and the mechanism doesn't have enough room to fully open. So there's definitely a sweet spot with getting these right, and I'm about to show that to you now. If this is your hinge, let's just draw it out. I'm not very good at drawing, so I do apologize. That's kind of what it's going to look like when it's open. As I said in the previous video, those leaves do not close, so they're parallel to one another. They end up creating like a point sort of thing on the end. But that's not the point of this. When you set the marking gauge, we're going to be setting it from this bottom leaf, i.e. something like that, and then we're going to extend the cutting point all the way up to a point that is just below the center of the pivot point of the hinge. And that amount can be, well, as small as you want, as long as it is below center by, let's say, about 0.5 millimeter. Because if you go all the way to the center point, then you have a risk of slightly overshooting it, and you get something like this, which we don't want. But here you go, you can see on here, it is set just below the center. Very, very small amount. So with that setting locked in, we are going to scratch a line along the top edge between those two boundary marks that we've just marked on with pencil. Great, okay, so we've got the two lines scratched along the top. Now we need to work out how far in those hinges are nested. So let me give you some more examples. So this is where the things that I said earlier come into play about shadow gaps, because if you would prefer not to have a shadow gap on the lid of your box, for example, perfectly understandable. You can see on this one, we've got a very, very small gap. I could have made it smaller, but you'll see if I flip this over, you'll see the price you have to pay in order to get that shadow gap small. What you have to do to achieve that is recess the hinge deeper into the component, and you end up getting this horrible ridge around the entire hinge. And this is down to that gap in the hinge. The fact that the two leaves don't close together perfectly means that if you install this, so that top edge is flush and that top edge is flush, then you end up getting this gap. Whereas, let me redraw that again. God, you thought I'd be better at drawing these by now. If you don't want that gap in the middle, you have to do something like that. So you see, we've got hardly any gap there at all, if any, but you've got this ridge sitting up above the hinge, which is exactly what you just looked at here. You have to recess this deeper into the wood in order to bring the wood closer to the pivot point of the hinge. And this is why it's better to buy high quality hinges for things like boxes, for example, where you don't want that shadow gap, where the leaves are really thick on them, very, very small gap in the middle, and yeah, I mean, that's a terrible drawing of one. But you see, if you were to install those flush with the surface, the gap in the middle is only as big as the gap between the hinges. And if they sit flat, then that gap is not going to be there. So for example, these Brusso hinges, they are really thick, really high quality. When they're closed, they close together flush. So as a result, I was able to install these so they're flush with the top surface and still know that it closes up completely, minus the little chamfer I've put on there, but you get the idea. Thicker leaves with a smaller gap between them means that you will get less of a shadow gap if you install those surfaces flush with the top of the wood. And ignore the amount of the mechanism poking out in this case. That's a bit of a design flaw with these hinges, to be honest, and they actually need to be poking out that much for it to work, but that's a video for another day. However, the benefit to having those gaps in the hinges is, like I said at the start, in order to achieve a shadow gap around cabinet doors or anything that is recessed within a frame. You need that shadow gap there, and if you install butt hinges flush, then they will naturally create the shadow gap for you. So make sure you choose your hinges carefully for each project. If you're doing a door, then you need some ideally with a small gap in them. If you're doing a box and you don't want that shadow gap, you're going to need thicker leaves on it that close together flush so the two edges are parallel. So then that leads on to the fourth mistake, which is not installing the hinge deep enough. And as a result, you get a huge shadow gap around the hinge when it's closed. It sits proud on the inside and it's quite an easy one to fix. You just cut it out a little deeper. So I think I've done enough chatting about that. So let's get on to marking out again. So now I'm going to set the marking gauge so it's flush with the top of the leaf. Nice and simple. And then with that setting, we're going to scratch this down the inside faces of these. Okay, so the next thing on this is we need to square lines across to join those two marking gauge lines together at the exact width of the hinge. So I've got the lines that I marked on there previously with the pencil. I'm going to put the square up to one of those and I'm going to scratch that line back. Then with the hinge, I'm going to put that up against the square without moving it. And I'm going to mark on the other side. Just a little knife mark there. You don't need to try and square across the hinge or anything. Just a little mark. And then once you've got that, you can put your knife into it, slide the square up, and then drag back. The reason I've done it this weird method is because if we've got the hinge, something like that, where I've just scratched this knife line, it's obviously a very fine point on here, and this is obviously me being very anal about things. But by having the square there, what I've done is scratch the line that is technically under the hinge. And then by not moving that, I put the hinge in place and I scratched a line this side of it. And what I've effectively done here is by offsetting those knife lines from the hinge, I have created a recess that is the exact size of it, because the hinge is now going to slot into this area and this area. So to you guys, it's shifted right a little bit, but the actual overall size is still exactly the same. Because if we were to get that hinge, put it on there and then just mark a knife mark there and a knife mark there and square it up, then you've got a recess that is larger than the hinge itself. Granted, that is by a very small amount because we are talking knives here, but this will be especially apparent if you don't use a knife and use a pen or pencil instead. We're talking about the really, really small details here. So with those two marks that I've scratched across the top, we're just going to roll it round and then join those with the marking gauge line scratched down the front. So you just put the knife into the mark on the corner, slide the square up, and then drag it back. Okay, now we can get on with chiseling this out. Right, so when you do this, what you don't want to do is put your chisel straight into any of these lines and give it a whack, because in doing so, it's just going to push the chisel back and you're going to end up getting a recess that is larger than the hinge. The other thing you don't want to do is come in from the marking gauge line on this side and just push it through, because obviously that is going to split up all the timber. So what I prefer to do here is hold the chisel nice and low, and we're going to do a series of horizontal chops along the length of this recess. But when you do this, don't go right up to that back edge, because just one misstep will put a horrible line up there. We're going to leave about 1 millimeter at the end to clean up afterwards. So I'll do one directly in the middle. And then, to be honest, it doesn't matter which way you step it from here. If you step it this way, then the chisel's going to get slightly wedged in there as you're chopping it out. Whereas if you go this way, which is what I prefer to do, you see it kind of splits off the material and it pushes it into the previous area. And it's nice and easy to get your chisel out after. So I'll stop about 1 millimeter from the end again. I'll do one chop with the chisel flip round this time. There we go. And now we'll go back the other way. And you see, by holding the chisel down the bottom like this, you get a lot of control from it rather than holding it right up here like a dagger. Okay, and with that grain all severed, now we can come in from the front. Once again though, you don't want to put your chisel straight into that marking gauge line that we've got. Where is it? There. because you'll be taking off too much material and you've got a chance of splitting it outside the areas that you've knifed. So we'll put it just above and take off about half of it, and just with a very sharp chisel, wiggle it side to side, don't push too much, and just carefully lever out those fibres. Okay, so I can see here that I've definitely gone deep enough with the chisel, but on these areas, doesn't look like I've quite gone down enough. So at this point, I'll maybe do a few more vertical chops just to ensure I've gone down to the full depth of the hinge. And there we go. You can see you can get a lot of control from this with just a chisel if you're careful, but in an ideal world, you could use something like this, a router plane that has a depth controlled chisel in it, or plane blade I guess. You set that to the depth of the hinge and then you just get it out like that. And that way you get a nice consistent depth all over the whole thing. You can get these in different sizes as well. This is the Veritas router plane, and I have done a video on this, so I'll put a link in the top corner where I compared it to the Lee Nielsen router plane. But we'll carry on with chisels for the sake of this. So I can still see I've got a tiny bit of the line left. It's just that little flaky bit that I've just broken off there. So I'll put the chisel into that line. Now I'm down to a close enough depth and just carefully pare back. So front edge is now done and is looking good. And at this point, we'll turn our attention to the sides. About 1 millimetre of material there. I don't want to take that off in one chop for reasons I said earlier. So I'll take off half of it, tap it down vertical, and then chisel into that line once I've relieved enough material. And there we go. We can finish by paring it off from this way. And that wall is done. And then instead of doing the other wall like this, I prefer to just spin it round so that then I've got the bevel facing the same way on every single cut, the mallet in the same hand for every cut, and the chisel in the same hand. If you make it repeatable like that, then you start getting into rhythms of things and it becomes a lot easier. All right, now just the back line to get sorted. So I'm looking along the length of it like this so I can see if the chisel is going in square or not. If you're looking from this direction, the only thing you can see is it rocking side to side like that, which doesn't matter in this case. What we want is to get a nice 90-degree wall at the back. These are all things that were covered in my video how to chisel correctly, so I'll put a link to that in the top corner, as well as the description. So exactly the same as before, taking off small amounts of material at a time, stepping back to get to that line. Now, the only thing you may experience here is the timber splitting in a direction you don't want it to. So for example, what's to say I don't put my chisel in that back line and then when I hit it, it splits along the grain and it splits outside of that recessed area. Well, with this, you've got to kind of look at the grain pattern, and I can see that the grain is sort of going off like this, away from the recess. So if I chisel it back here, then it's going to follow that grain and it's going to curve away. Whereas if I start chiseling here, and work my way back, then this loose material can't actually split outside of the recess. So we'll give that a go. So still working back to that line as close as I can get it. And the other thing you could do is maybe sever it halfway down. So if it does try and split, it can't go any further than the point that you've just severed. And I'll do that at the ends with the knife as well. Here we go. So I'm putting the chisel into the line. All right, and then to transfer that to the other component, something I would advise you not to do is just put a knife mark there and put a knife mark there, because there's no real, there's more of a chance for it to go wrong. It's better to repeat the method of marking out we did before with the square and the offset and everything like that. But before you do this, find out which leaf fits the recess better, which is that one in that case, and we're going to put a little A in there, or a 1 or an X or a picture of a cat or something like that, I don't know. And then on the back of the hinge, we're also going to knife in a little A as well. And then on the other side, we're going to somehow scratch a B into this as well. Oh, what a horrible sound that is. So then A will always go into A, and B, which is going to be this one, will always go into there. And if you've got two hinges on a door, you want the other ones to be C and D. Because if you mix these up, it's not too much of an issue, but if you mix the top and bottom ones up, then if you go through the steps I showed you in the previous video, then you're going to have problems. Because after going through that process, these hinges may not be the same size. So what we are going to do is get the ends of this block flush. I'm going to put a knife mark at the bottom, and then with that knife mark there, we're going to go through the same process as we did before. So knife goes into that mark, slide the square up, scribe back. Don't move the square at all. Find side B, pop that up against the square, put a little mark at the opposite side, and then put the knife into that mark, slide it up, drag back. And there we go. In theory, those should be in the same place. And then we'll go through the same process as before, chop out that hinge, and then we'll join them together and see what they look like. All right, so now we can screw these hinges in place. Unfortunately, I don't have any screws small enough to actually countersink into there properly. The heads stick a little bit proud, and I just tried to countersink it and I ended up damaging the hinge. But in any normal case, if this happens, it is possible to countersink them, but just make sure to get a smaller countersink than this one. So ignore that little nick, you can see it on the knuckle there. We are going to need an awl of some kind for this, so a little pokey device. And we're going to mark the location of the screw holes. Now when you do this, bear in mind, because they're countersunk heads, if that screw hole is not central and is actually more towards this outside face, when you put the screw in, the countersunk head is actually going to pull it out like that. It won't be that much, hopefully, but it's going to pull it away from the recess, and then those shadow gaps on the knuckle will be showing, and it just won't look very good. So when you do this, try and mark it as central as possible, but if anything, edge it slightly towards the back wall. This does take a lot of care to get right, but that means when the screws go in, oh, that one was completely off. When the screws go in, it's going to pull this hinge tighter into the recess and be nice and secure in there. So there we go. That is how I personally go about cutting out recesses for butt hinges. These are looking lovely, apart from the fact the screw heads are sitting proud, and as a result, hitting when trying to close the hinge. But other than that, they're installed incredibly neatly, there's no gaps around them, and with a better choice in screw and a little bit of a clean up on the wood around the hinge, these would be ready to be installed in a lovely, fine piece of furniture. So bear in mind that with these butt hinges, we've got the shadow gap on the outside, which would be perfect for a door. It's just up to you from this point to make that shadow gap consistent around the entire door. I will be doing videos on this in the future, lots of cabinet-based projects coming up this year, so keep an eye out for them. If you're watching this video because you want to hinge a box, then bear in mind that you are either going to have to recess those hinges deeper and then maybe create some sort of decorative chamfer going down to the hinge if you want to have no shadow gap at all, or invest in some thicker hinges where the leaves close together flush and the outsides of them are parallel. That will also prevent you from getting a shadow gap around the top of the box. So, I hope you found this video useful. Don't forget to like the video if you liked the video, subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you in the next video.